There is a particular kind of silence that exists in Japanese homes before sunrise, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of preparation. And if you have ever stood in that silence, or even imagined it, you already understand something that most Americans have never been taught to value, that the most important financial decisions a person makes are not made in a bank, or in front of a screen, or inside the office of a financial advisor. They are made in the first quiet minutes of the morning, before the world has the chance to tell you what to want. In the United States, the prevailing belief is that wealth is built through action, through buying, through investing, through moving money from one place to another with enough speed and enough confidence. The financial industry has spent decades reinforcing this belief because an active client is a profitable client. Movement creates fees, urgency creates transactions, and transactions, above all else, are what sustain the machinery. But in Japan, particularly in the Japan that existed before the modern financial system arrived, the understanding was different, profoundly different. Wealth was not understood as the result of action. It was understood as the result of attention, of a very specific, very disciplined kind of daily attention that began before the sun rose and cost absolutely nothing to practice. What I am going to share with you today is not taught in any American financial planning course. It was not written in any best-selling book about money. It was passed from father to son, from merchant to apprentice, across generations of Japanese families who understood that the foundation of lasting financial stability is not a strategy. It is a ritual, and the ritual begins at dawn. To understand why this morning practice works, and why it works at a level that no Western financial method has been able to replicate, we need to travel back to Japan of the Edo period, specifically to the city of Osaka in the early 18th century. Osaka in that era was known throughout Japan as the nation's kitchen, the commercial heart of an empire. But it was also something else, something that Western historians have rarely given it proper credit for. It was the birthplace of the most sophisticated merchant philosophy the world had ever seen. While traders in Amsterdam were gambling on tulip futures and London merchants were speculating in the South Sea Company, the great merchant families of Osaka were doing something entirely different. They were thinking in generations. The Konoike family is perhaps the most documented example of this generational thinking. The Konoike began as sake brewers in the late 16th century during the Sengoku period. By the time the Edo period stabilized Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 1600s, the Konoike had transformed into financial intermediaries, managing the money of feudal lords across the country. By 1700, they had become the wealthiest private financial institution in Japan. They managed what would be the equivalent today of billions of dollars in assets. And they did it without a stock exchange, without derivatives, without leverage in the modern sense. What they had instead was a code, an internal system of practices that governed how money was perceived, counted, and approached, not once a month, not at year's end, but every single morning. The Konoike household, like many of the great Osaka merchant families, followed a tradition called chobo kanri, ledger management. But this phrase, taken literally, undersells what it actually was. It was not merely bookkeeping, it was a meditative accounting practice performed at the beginning of each day, before business commenced, before conversations began, before any decision was made. The head of the household, and later the eldest son being trained in the family tradition, would sit in a specific room of the house, always the same room, always in the same position, and would open what they called the Ie no Cho, the household ledger. But here is what Western observers have always misunderstood about this ledger. It was not primarily a record of transactions. It was a record of awareness. Every morning, the practice was not to add new numbers. It was to read what was already there, to look at what the household possessed, what it owed, what it had committed to in the future, and to sit with those numbers in complete silence. No judgment, no planning, no problem solving, just witnessing. This practice was deeply influenced by the Buddhist concept of mushin, no mind, which the samurai class had adopted as the foundation of combat readiness, and which the merchant class of Osaka adopted as the foundation of financial readiness. A mind that is agitated cannot see clearly. A mind that begins the day in reaction to news, to fear, to social pressure, to desire, will make decisions that feel justified in the moment and regrettable in the years that follow. The Mitsui family, founders of what would eventually become one of Japan's largest financial conglomerates, practiced a similar morning discipline. Hachirobe Mitsui, who lived from 1622 to 1694 and is considered the architect of the Mitsui merchant empire, wrote in his family code, the Mitsui Chohoki, that a merchant who does not know his exact position before the sun rises is a merchant who will be moved by the wind. And in commerce, being moved by the wind means being moved by other people's desires, by fashion, by rumor, by the momentum of the market. This is not a metaphor for caution. It is a precise psychological diagnosis. The samurai, for their part, had a parallel practice that fed into the merchant tradition. The Hagakure, the 18th century text compiled by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, contains a passage that is rarely quoted in Western discussions of samurai philosophy. A warrior who does not know the weight of what he carries cannot move with precision. This weight was understood not only as physical, but as financial. A samurai who did not know the state of his household's resources, his stipend, his debts, his obligations, was considered as dangerous to himself as a warrior who had not sharpened his blade. The discipline, in other words, was the same across both classes. See clearly before you act. Know your position before you move. And every morning, in the silence before dawn, the great households of Japan did exactly that. The practice itself, the morning financial ritual, is built on a concept that most Americans have encountered in a different context: Kaizen. Most people in the West know Kaizen as a business philosophy of continuous incremental improvement, the method that transformed Japanese manufacturing in the post-war period and influenced companies like Toyota. But Kaizen, at its philosophical root, is much older than the Toyota production system, and it is much more personal. The word itself means, quite literally, change for the better. Kai, change. Zen, good. But the original application of this principle within the merchant families of the Edo period was not about factory floors or production cycles. It was about the self, about the daily unhurried examination of one's own condition, financial, physical, relational, with the intention not of dramatic transformation, but of slight, consistent correction. The morning financial ritual of the Osaka merchants was kaizen applied to money. Not the kaizen of urgency, the kaizen of patience. Here is what the practice looks like in its essential form, stripped of the historical context, but not of its philosophical core. You begin in silence. This is not optional. The silence is not preparation for the ritual. The silence is the ritual. For the first several minutes of the morning, before you open any record of your finances, you sit in a position of physical stillness, and you ask yourself one question, only one. It is the same question the Konoike family asked for over 300 years. What do I actually have, and what do I actually owe? Not what you wish you had, not what you are expecting, not what the market did yesterday, or what your account was worth at its peak. What you have, precisely and honestly, at this moment. This sounds simple. It is not. Because to answer that question honestly, you must first resist the very powerful temptation to add interpretation. Americans, in particular, are trained to contextualize their financial position. The savings account is low, but the investments compensate. The debt is high, but the asset values are rising. The retirement account is behind, but there is still time. These are all stories. And stories, however comforting, are not numbers. The Japanese practice demands that you see the number first and construct no story around it for at least 5 minutes. You look at what is there. You breathe. You do not react. You witness. There is a Japanese proverb that speaks directly to this. Jibun no kage wo fumenai. You cannot step on your own shadow. The meaning, in the context of personal finance, is precise. You cannot manage what you refuse to see clearly. The shadow is always there. It follows you exactly. The only question is whether you turn to face it in the morning light when you are rested and still and capable of seeing without panic, or whether you meet it at night when fatigue distorts everything. Psychologically, this practice works because of what neuroscientists now call the morning cortisol peak. In the first hour after waking, the human brain is in a state of heightened clarity and reduced emotional noise. This is when decisions made are most likely to reflect actual values rather than reactive emotion. The Japanese merchant families did not know the term cortisol, but they observed across centuries that the man who counted his resources in silence at dawn made better decisions throughout the day than the man who first encountered his finances in the middle of business, surrounded by noise and obligation. The practice continues with what the Osaka merchants called the mitoshi, the long view. After sitting with the current numbers, the practitioner would then spend a few minutes not planning, but projecting. Not optimistically, not pessimistically. Simply honestly. If the household continued on its current path, unchanged, where would it be in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10? This projection was never used to generate urgency. It was used to generate clarity. There is a difference. Urgency causes movement for its own sake. Clarity causes movement in the right direction. The last element of the ritual is what I find most profound and most absent from Western financial practice. It is called kansha, gratitude, in its deepest sense. Before closing the ledger each morning, the practitioner would acknowledge in silence what the household had, not compared to others, not as a comfort for what it lacked, simply as a fact. This acknowledgement was understood to create what the merchants called jiko kanri, self-governance. A person who begins the day with a clear and grateful awareness of their actual position is a person who is not easily manipulated by desire, by fear, or by the financial noise of the marketplace. In the language of modern behavioral economics, this is called anchoring to reality. But the Osaka merchants would have found that phrase incomplete. They were not merely anchoring to reality. They were building a relationship with reality, a daily, consistent, respectful relationship, the same way one builds a relationship with another person, through regular, honest, unhurried attention. If you have ever felt, sitting in front of a financial advisor, that something important was missing from the conversation, that the spreadsheets were precise, but the wisdom was absent, your instinct was correct. And there is a specific reason why this morning practice never traveled west. It is not because the West lacked discipline. It is because the West had something that worked against this kind of practice, an economic structure that was built on the opposite principle. The Western financial system, as it developed from the 17th century onward, required not stillness, but stimulation. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, created for the first time in history a mechanism by which the value of an asset could change multiple times in a single day. This was, in its way, a remarkable innovation. But it also established a foundational assumption that has never been fully examined, that financial awareness means knowing what things are worth right now, at this moment, compared to what they were worth a moment ago. This is a completely different relationship with money than the one practiced in Edo period Japan. In Osaka, financial awareness meant knowing what things were worth to your household, across time, independent of what others were willing to pay for them today. The Konoike family did not check the price of rice every morning because rice prices fluctuated. They assessed the state of their household because their household was their primary financial reality. When American financial culture developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, it inherited the European model wholesale: markets, prices, comparison, movement. And it added to this inheritance something uniquely American: the idea that the responsible financial citizen is one who is constantly engaged, reading reports, monitoring accounts, responding to information. The financial industry reinforced this idea because an engaged client is a client who acts, and a client who acts generates revenue. There was also a structural reason why this Japanese practice never transferred. The great merchant families of Osaka transmitted their financial codes orally within the household. The Mitsui Chohoki was not a public document. The Konoike practices were not advertised. These were private systems, understood to have competitive value precisely because they were not shared. When Western scholars first studied Japanese business culture in the Meiji period, and again after World War II, they documented what they could observe from the outside: the efficiency, the collectivism, the long-term planning. But the internal morning practices, the silence, the ledger, the projection, the gratitude, these were inside the household. They were invisible. And so what arrived in American business culture was the Toyota method, the Kaizen of the factory floor, the lean production system. Valuable, true, but incomplete. The outer form of Japanese discipline without the inner practice from which it grew. There is also something in Protestant American culture that made this specific practice difficult to adopt, even if it had been understood. The Puritan tradition, which shaped American attitudes toward money more than any other force, emphasized action as the proof of virtue. Sitting in silence with a ledger, doing nothing, deciding nothing, simply witnessing. This would have seemed to the 18th century American commercial mind like a failure of will, idleness. The Japanese understanding that the highest form of preparation is stillness was not just unknown. It was culturally counterintuitive. And so an entire morning discipline, refined across centuries, backed by the success of families whose financial legacies lasted 300 years, was simply never offered to the Western world, not hidden deliberately, simply transmitted in a different way, through a different kind of inheritance that the Western financial system had no mechanism to receive. Bringing this practice into your life does not require you to change your financial situation. It requires only that you change the first 15 minutes of your morning. This is the beauty of a $0 ritual. Its cost is only your attention. Begin by choosing a consistent time and a consistent place. The Osaka merchants were specific about this, the same room, the same position, before business began. For you, this might mean the kitchen table before anyone else is awake, or a chair near a window while the house is still quiet. Consistency is not a preference here. It is the mechanism. The brain builds familiarity with practice through repetition, and familiarity reduces the resistance that prevents most people from ever looking at their finances honestly. In the first week, the practice is simply this. Spend 10 minutes in silence before you open any financial record. Do not check your phone. Do not read the news. Sit still and ask yourself the question the Konoike merchants asked every morning for 3 centuries. What do I actually have, and what do I actually owe? Try to answer it from memory first. You may be surprised by how vague your actual knowledge is, and that vagueness itself is the first thing the practice corrects. In the second week, open a simple record, not an app with charts and projections, a piece of paper if you are willing, or the simplest spreadsheet you can create. Write 4 numbers: what you have in savings, what you owe, your monthly income, your monthly essential expenses. Look at these numbers in silence for 5 minutes. No story, no context, just the numbers. In the third week, add the mitoshi, the long view. If these 4 numbers stayed exactly as they are and nothing changed, where would you be in 1 year? Write that number. Do not react to it. Simply see it. In the 4th week, end the practice with kancha. 1 minute of quiet acknowledgement of what is there. Not forced optimism. Simply honest recognition that you have something, knowledge, assets, time, capability, that you did not have before you began. After 1 month, you will have done something that most Americans have never done in their lives. You will have looked at your financial reality clearly, calmly, and honestly 30 times in a row. That consistency is more powerful than any single financial decision you could make. It is the foundation from which all other decisions become better. The man who watches this kind of content late in the evening, in the quiet of his home, is not looking for a shortcut. He already knows there are none. He is looking for something more valuable than a shortcut. He is looking for the right frame, the right way of seeing. Because he understands, at a level that goes beyond what any financial advisor has been able to articulate, that the problem was never information. He has had plenty of information. The problem was relationship, his relationship with his own financial reality, honest, unafraid, consistent. If the consumer culture of the last 50 years told you to look away from your numbers, to keep spending, and trust that the future would take care of itself, then what you have been doing in this quiet hour of learning is not new. It is a return. A return to the kind of attention that the great merchant families of Osaka understood as the most fundamental act of financial intelligence. You were right to feel that something was missing. What was missing was the practice of seeing. There is something that the Mitsui family code mentioned that I have not yet explained, a second element of the morning ritual that goes deeper than the ledger, something that the Edo period merchants considered even more important than tracking what they had. We will examine that in the next teaching. It requires a certain stillness to fully understand. I think you are ready for it.